Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is charged with the idea of taking the lessons from the past and transferring them to our future.
As stewards of history in the Birmingham movement, the BCRI houses incredible collections that show and document where the community has come from and how the Birmingham movement both came to be and was so successful.
For more than 25 years, the Institute has educated people about what happened here in the 60s, not just in Birmingham, but across our country. Civil rights and equality challenged today just as they were many decades ago. We are here to enlighten each generation about civil and human rights by exploring our common past and working together in the present to build a better future.
Through many educational offerings, we teach the idea that the changes in Birmingham, Alabama were not just because of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. A lot of these changes took place because of the youth in this city. And due to that, we have a mission to share with the youth of today what youth in their generations in the past have done. Through our Legacy Youth Leadership Program, we bring high school students from all over the Jefferson County area here to study this narrative and to serve as docents and ambassadors to the Civil Rights Institute. We have BCAP, which is the Birmingham Cultural Alliance Project, where we visit middle school students and we take them through this history and through this narrative so that they can prepare to understand their role in society. We have outreach programs that visit many schools and institutions to highlight the story of accomplishment, the story of overcoming, the story of a power and the movement that people in Birmingham were able to bring to bear to change not only the city, but the state, the nation, and the world.
By making it accessible to researchers and local students from middle, high, and university students, they're able to come in and see where we've been so that they can go and be better stewards of Birmingham and our present and then our future.
Thank you for joining us for this engaging virtual conversation series. We invite you to help us continue the work for civil rights through racial justice by becoming a member or donating to our work. You can find us on our social media platforms to stay connected with us. Thanks again for your support.
How are you?
Hello.
Good afternoon. How are you? Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
I can hear you.
Thank you so much for welcome to Stand Up for Justice Conference, the Quest for Freedom and Justice for Black America. And I will be moderating today. Before we go any further, I would like to thank the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute for hosting this important conversation and for allowing us to have this honest and authentic dialogue. So I'm going to ask our distinguished panel to introduce themselves. We'll start with you first, Dr. Morgan, and then we'll begin with you, Judge Sparks.
Okay, I am Dr. Catherine Morgan. I am Professor of Criminal Justice and Director of African American Studies at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. In September of 2021, I will have been a part of the UAB family for the past 30 years. And so it has been quite an experience. I've seen a lot of changes, during that time. I do, in my research and teaching, I teach and do research on race and crime, correctional decision-making, and how it affects marginalized groups, particularly African Americans and Hispanics. I look at parole and probation decisions, again, and how they affect particularly African Americans. Correctional, look at wrongful convictions, writing a book on wrongful convictions and what happens to people, once they have spent time on death row and have been exonerated, what happens to their lives after that time. So I'm glad to be here today, and I hope that I can share some information, that's beneficial about what's going on in our criminal justice system and what we hope to see in the future. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. We'll have you next, Dr. Bessie. You can unmute yourself.
Good morning.
I was talking to Ms. Buzz, but can you hear us? All right, there you go. We can't hear you. I'm sorry. Judge, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself while we wait on you?
Absolutely. It's great to see you this morning, Katrina.
Good to see you too.
So grateful to be part of this panel. I made it to this program by way of being a product of Birmingham school system. Grew up here until I matriculated at Tuskegee University and then the University of Alabama's School of Law. Did a stint as a JAG officer in the United States Army, and came back to Birmingham to practice law. Been on the bench for the last 25 years or so, about 12 years at Jefferson County Family Court, and actually about 12 years now I've been at the city of Birmingham Municipal Court, and for the last 10 years or so I've been the presiding judge. I deal with these issues, of course, on a daily basis, both from a theoretical standpoint and a practical standpoint, how we deal with the issues that are discussed in this program today, and I'm excited to have a discussion about it. Thanks for inviting.
Thanks, Judge. All right, Ms. West, let's see if we can hear you now. No, we still can't. All right, everybody, bear with us 1 second. Let's see if we can get this technical difficulty worked out. No, we still can't. Okay, so Ms. West, if you get it together, we'll come back and let you introduce yourself. So before the interest of time, we have some really tough questions, and I'm excited to have this conversation. If you see me looking off to the side, I'm getting text messages, I'm looking in the chat, so there may be other questions that are coming forth. But the first question that I was given today was about cash bail. There is this data that is out there that states that there is a implicit bias against poor people as it relates to having a cash bail. You can have someone of means who commits the exact same crime as somebody who is poor, and because they can afford bail, they're able to wait for their trial at home, maybe with a monitor, but still at home nonetheless. Whereas with poor people, sometimes they have to wait days, weeks, even months in jail for their crime. And so this question is two-part. One, why is cash bond still the protocol? And then two, what is another alternative? What can we do to create equality and equity as it relates to still having people be held accountable, but also making sure that it's fair and equitable across the board? Dr. Morgan, Judge Sparks, either one of you guys can hop in and let's talk.
Cash money bail system is problematic. We started really looking at the bail system and how people pretrial release back in the 1800s. In the 1800s, a judge in Massachusetts used release on recognizance, release people on their word that they would appear, agreeing to appear. And so early on, they started to recognize, the difficulties of money, cash money, the bail system, because it discriminates against the poor, because many times the poor will not have the funds to get out, the 10% or whatever it takes to get out. And so realizing that not getting out on bail really has implications for outcomes. If you can't get out on bail, you're more likely to be convicted. You're more likely to get a more severe sentence. So we started to look at that and how it disproportionately affected African Americans and Hispanics. So in the 1960s, the Vera Institute decided to do a study. And they discovered that people who are released on recognizance did in fact show up, and some of that's bias, where people didn't believe that if you were, minority or marginalized group, that you would not show up. So consequently, they found that people do show up if they are released on their word. And so consequently, they implemented what is called the Manhattan Bail Project. And this project made release on recognizance the order of the day. And it worked well until the bail winds shifted in the 80s. When we decided we were going to get tough on crime and criminals, then we shifted and said dangerous people need to be locked up and they need to be kept. And so then we went back to the whole idea of the money cash bail system. Now, one of the things, I did a study a couple of years ago looking particularly at women in pretrial release. And one of the things that I found is that Black women and Hispanic women are more likely to stay in jail because they cannot afford the bond. Even when it's $500, they can't afford to get out on bond. They can't afford to post a bail. And so because of that, again, it results in them going to prison more, it results in them getting a more severe sentence, even if it's not prison, but they get a more severe sentence. And some jurisdictions implemented what is called the Mother's Day Project, trying to get mothers home, raise money for bail for women who are incarcerated. And so it is problematic because it does have long-term implications for what happens, in the outcome of that case. So it is important.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. Judge Clark, you speak on that. Then Ms. Wilson, you get ready to cut in and answer the question and just introduce yourself as well, okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd love to talk about this because, and I want to thank Dr. Morgan for all her research she's done in this area. And of course, she has a great body of information to research because the bail issue is not a new issue. It has been in existence since the framers of the Constitution created this country. And in fact, the issues that we depend on actually came over from England. And well before that, the issue of bail was on the table, Katrina. It's become the sure again, and rightfully so. But let me say this to you. The issue of bail is complex, and it's complex depending on the level of jurisdiction you are. I'm at a misdemeanor court. Everything we do everything that happens within our jurisdiction is no greater than a misdemeanor. And so we have a different look in some instances at bail. But let me say this to you. I hear a lot of conversation about affordability, ability to pay. While that can be a concern when it comes to setting bail, it's not the only concern. There are other things that have to be considered. It's not the controlling factor. And in fact, if we go back historically, Katrina, this is about the third wave of that's taken place. This wave of bail reform is focused primarily at the court system. The problem is the court doesn't set the bail bonding system. It only follows it. And so I think a more effective route for changing the bail bond schedules, the bail bond system, would probably be at the legislature, which and change those laws. Bond is not per se excessive. Listen to me now, not per se excessive just because someone can't afford it. All right. Just because they can't afford it doesn't mean you set too much bail. Truth of the matter is, to use an example, just because a car you might have your eye on, all right, has a certain price on it, doesn't mean the value on that car is too expensive simply because you can't afford to pay the price for that car. What we need to have in place and make sure we have is judges who will look at each individual defendant, look at their particular circumstances, and determine whether or not this is going to have an adverse effect on them. We look at two factors: whether or not they have a history of failing to appear, and whether or not it presents a danger to the public when it comes to letting people out. Those primary factors control us when it comes to setting bond, and they usually allow us to take a deeper dive into determining whether or not people are eligible to leave. Do I look at whether they're going to lose their job or potentially lose their job? Absolutely. How can I not look at a person's life and make a determination on whether or not they show up? But if I've given them bail before and they fail to show up 4 times, then of course they've given me a more difficult situation to evaluate. And so it's complex. And I think we keep oversimplifying it by using it as talking points. If we sit down and have a robust discussion about it, I believe we can come up with some solutions that will help everybody, the bench, the public, and the defendant get through these situations.
So, Judge, I know you gave an example about it being on a legislative level, but what are some of the solutions that you're talking about? I know we don't have enough time to have the robust conversation, but if you were just going to hit 1 or 2 points, what would be some of the solutions?
The first solution is make sure you put judges on the bench who have compassion, who understand how to look at folk, and who, while they understand that it's okay to deal with the issue of crime, being tough on crime doesn't necessarily always mean being tough on people. And you also have to determine whether or not you have the right policies in place in a particular court system. And those policies can affect how you deal with those issues. Understand this now. The legislature, those who have crafted the laws, have always seen fit, Dr. Morgan's research will bear this out, always seen fit to carve out certain cases where bond or bail should not apply, where it should not be available. We're not talking about those cases. It's pretty settled that in certain areas, if you're on murder cases, that's going to be a case where bail is going to probably not be afforded to you in certain circumstances. We're talking about those middle of the road cases that people get over and over again. Ironically, Katrina, those are the cases that the police have to put a whole lot of work into, because when you have drug offenses, I think people ought to get drug treatment. When you have people who are homeless, I think the community ought to put in place practices that will allow people to get some form of habilitation help. Those are the issues that we have to deal with. The community can step forward and deal with situations. Habilitation should not be criminal. Well, let me say this: lack of habilitation, lack of homes, lack of a solid place to live should not be criminalized by picking people up and bringing them to jail. We're working real hard to make sure that people who are only experiencing homelessness don't sit in our jails. In fact, we're trying to make sure they don't have to come to jail. First place. That takes investment and that takes resources from the community in order to make that happen.
All right, Ms. Busby, let me see if we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Great. Awesome. So I will go ahead and answer the first question. And before I do that, am I supposed to introduce myself, Katrina?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
All right. I am Jatan Bosby, the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama. Our organization focuses on the advancements of civil rights and civil liberties in various areas, particularly in the courtroom, in the community, and in the state legislature. So I'm very happy to be here today with Dr. Morgan and Judge Sparks and yourself, Katrina. Thank you so much. But jumping into the first question, I believe that Dr. Morgan and Judge Sparks really laid the foundation, but we have to understand what bail means, particularly in this space, right? It is essentially a mechanism in which further talks about, or further, if you will, reinforces an economic system that puts into subjugation Black and Brown people and criminalizes poverty. And so the best way that we can balance, I would say, or combat these inequities is ending bail as we know it, ending cash bail. And so what we're seeing across the state are bailout funds, Tuscaloosa bailout, the Montgomery bailout, in which grassroots organizers are coming together collectively to focus on pretrial and to bail people out that are being held in pretrial detention. And those are some of the steps that we can take until, to your point, Judge Sparks, we can be more intentional about making sure we're ending cash bail at the legislative level, right? So lobbying your your legislators, and ensuring that ending cash bail and pretrial reforms are at the forefront of really the broader issues that we see in our criminal legal system and the inequities and disproportionate rates that we see that Dr. Morgan has elevated. So those are the areas that we are focusing on as an organization.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Does anybody want to follow up? Dr. Morgan, is your hand up?
One of the things I didn't mention is that I started teaching early, and so decided I need some real world experience. So I left the classroom. I'm from Texas. And so I spent 3 years as a felony adult probation officer in Jefferson County, down below Houston in the Beaumont area. And I was in court a lot. I wrote pre-sentence investigation reports for the court, and I supervised a felony adult caseload. And again, bail was one of those issues that, I grappled with when I would go to court or when I would interview offenders, who could not get out on bail. And what I saw is, somebody mentioned, sometimes we criminalize mental illness. And I saw people who stayed in jail because they couldn't get out on bail, but who needed, to be in a place like Taylor Hardin, and needed to be, receive some kind of drug and alcohol treatment. So it's one of those issues. One of the things that some states have done, Judge Sparks mentioned the possibility of legislative actions. So some states implemented what we call bail schedules, and they would put bail schedules in jails, and they would recommend certain amounts for certain offenses, because they were looking at, they said most important thing should be, crime seriousness as well as prior criminal history. But what research found is that people didn't stay in those bail schedules, that typically judges would go outside of the bail schedules, sometimes increasing the amount of bail for Hispanics and African Americans, reducing the amount, of proposed bail for white females. And so again, we've tried some things, and you're right, we're going to have to be more intentional about looking at bail and how it's used, because we don't want to criminalize poverty, which is what we've done.
So I love that you have these three different perspectives, right? And so Judge is talking about it from the effect on the community. If a person is going to be a problem for the community, that's something that judges have to consider.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I love that we are talking about legislation and having it in a form. One of the other questions that somebody just sent in that kind of touches on what Judge was talking about is policing, right? Over policing in Black communities, right? And we're all Black, so we understand and we get what they're talking about when they say that. But one of the things, and I want to get your opinions and your thoughts on this. I was having a conversation with someone this morning, and they said to me, I think that a lot of white officers, or just white people in general, sometimes their first interaction with Black people is through Black music and Black media, right? Or the movies, or how we're portrayed in movies. And so there is this bias out there that Black people are aggressive, naturally aggressive, more aggressive. I know as an attorney, and I'm sure some other people can speak to this, when I'm having a conversation with someone and I am being firm, I am seen as being disrespectful or being rude, or those are the characteristics that are labeled to Black women because that's what they see in the movies. And so all that to say, when we talk about policing, right? What are your thoughts about the bias that people bring to the job first and foremost? And then how do we get to a point? What do we do to get officers to understand that there is a such thing as implicit bias, and that it does sometimes affect how we interact and how we talk and how we deal with some of the people that they are responsible for dealing with in the community?
Katrina, I want to help with that answer, but before I do, I want to just piggyback a little bit on what Dr. Morgan said about bail schedules. The 11th Circuit has said that bail schedules are problematic, and that a person who is facing a bail hearing needs to have what's called a meaningful hearing. A meaningful hearing, which can't be done in front of a magistrate, needs to be done in front of a judge, so that he can explore He can explore the background and give conditions of release if they are needed. In Alabama, the requirement for being a magistrate is a high school diploma.
Oh, wow.
It's a high school diploma in Alabama. Of course, you know, judges are going to have law degrees and be licensed to practice. And most jurisdictions have some degree of seasoning about them before they take the bench. It's simply a different look at a person. The requirements may be different in Texas for magistrates to serve. But in fact, that's one of the complications we have. There is no uniformity across the nation when it comes to how bail is set and who has the ability to set it. And so we're grateful that we can have meaningful hearings, and particularly in Birmingham. All our hearings are held by judges. We look at people individually to determine whether or not they are set. But with respect to the policing issue, I started out, Katrina, when you asked me a few minutes ago, what are some of the reforms we can make? The first thing I told you is we can have judges on the bench who are studied and experienced, so that if those other parts of the justice system have some failing, we at least have people in place who can catch those things and resolve them. I don't necessarily want to talk to the issue of policing from that standpoint, although I know it's problematic. I've been in the back of a car that's been pulled over in Birmingham when I wasn't doing nothing. I understand that. But from the issue of my position now, I know good judges can make the difference and have always made the difference. And that's where I think we need to start.
Okay. Ms. Bosby, do you have an opinion or a comment on that as relates to over-policing in the Black community?
Yes. So the truth of the matter is we need to reduce the interactions between our communities and policing. So we have seen that implicit bias trainings instituted after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and in the 90s, and ongoing reforms of these consistent implicit bias trainings have essentially proven not to be effective. The issue itself is modern day policing and the system by which it was built upon. So what we need to do is begin reimagining what policing looks like in our communities, divesting, reinvesting in the communities. And I think that that really gets to the crux of the issue. So I don't have a lot of opinions on implicit bias training outside of the fact that we know that it is not essentially effective. And we need to reimagine how police are interacting with our communities generally.
Dr. Morgan.
Yes. I was reading something, actually teaching a class this semester on race, crime, and social policy. And one of the things that I look at is police interactions with the particularly Black community, also with the Hispanic community. And what we see is that police interact with the Black community based on stereotypes. And that stereotype is that of dangerousness. And what it does, it allows, or it results oftentimes in police stopping young Black men and frisking them because they see them as members of gangs or they see them as involved in criminal activities. And so it's that stereotyping, that bias that says, you know, you're dangerous. And sometimes we get it from media, we get it from media, we get it from even criminological theories. And as you were talking, I thought about back in the 90s, we had this whole idea of the super predator. This idea, criminologists came up with this idea that, there's going to be a violence epidemic, and that violence epidemic is going to be caused by young Black males who are armed, dangerous, and carry guns. And so we saw the super predator, all of that being a part of it. And that's an issue that came back to visit Hillary Clinton when she was running for president, because, she took that idea of the super predator. And so it's that kind of thinking, it's that kind of vision, of Black males as criminals that has been problematic with policing in their interaction. And so in looking at police shootings of unarmed men, said a lot of it has to do with that unconscious bias or that stereotype of that Black male as being dangerous. And so, we see with racial profiling using race as a proxy for dangerousness. And I'm going to say this about it, and then I'm reading a book now called Chokehold. And it says that there is a construction that the thug is a social construction. And it is often used by police, in policing the Black community, and particularly the African-American male, that it's a social construction. You see this person, you stereotype this individual as being dangerous, as being a threat to society. And I could give other examples of, ideas where the Black male is seen as being a threat to society and needs to be controlled. And that influences, that impacts how police interact with the community, and particularly Black males.
Absolutely. Did anybody else want to add to that or respond to that at all?
Well, the fact of the matter is, Katrina, that within our community, we African-American men are victims of stereotype. Take me out of a courtroom, take my robe off, put me in blue jeans, and I'm subjected to the same issues that any other Black male is subjected to. I realize that. I also realize the reverse of that there are too many young Black men in our community who do mean ill to people within our community. We can't have a conversation without having the full conversation. And we need to figure out how to deal with the issues that they're dealing with so that they don't see their fellow citizens as prey or easy marks. We also need to make sure, and I don't know that enough people talk about this, I need for more young men to want to be in law, young African Americans or minorities to want to be in law enforcement. We don't have enough. We don't have enough options for young folk to go into our communities and police communities, and the folks who are doing the policing look like the folk they're policing. That's important. I guarantee you that would end up making a difference down the road, because that would be a level of cultural awareness of what's going on in that community. And so this is not a simple issue. I struggle when I go out. I have to have the conversation with my family members about how you deal with circumstances, but it's complex. And we have been stereotyped. Let me say that. We have been stereotyped. I do feel the pressure, but I also feel the pressure to make sure I communicate with other folk that there are some things we can do about changing.
Let me ask a question. I'm sorry, but
No, go ahead, Dr. Moore.
Why is it so difficult to handle or to have that conversation in our communities, that we have a responsibility in our communities to tell our young men and our young people that this is not the way to go? How do we have that conversation? Because oftentimes, it is a very difficult conversation to have. And I have said to some groups that, maybe didn't like it much. And I said, we have to value life and the lives of our young men in our communities, that we have to value their lives. And so how do you have that conversation? Judge Sparks, anybody, how do you have that conversation?
Complexity of that conversation is a conversation that has to take place in many sectors of our community. Mm-hmm. It has to start in the home. There has to be a value set in the home of what is right and what is wrong. That has to be taught from the time these young folk are brought into the world and how they interact with their family members. That has to also translate to the school. We used to teach civics and what's appropriate in school. We used to teach respect for the government in school. Not so much anymore. That needs to be a part of the discussion. And then there needs to be a general community discussion about how we interact with one another. We're probably more segregated than we've been ever in our community now, not just based on race, but also based on economics. Mm-hmm. Based on economics, we struggle. Yes. We struggle with being able to communicate across lines. And it's not, there's some people who have means who still think it's inappropriate to go into certain sections of our community, regardless of what the color is. And that's problematic. I want us to get back to a place. I'd like to see us get back to a place where we can start having these conversations in school with young folks. Mm-hmm. Then we'll raise up a new generation of young folk who have a deeper respect for policing, who have a deeper respect for what it means to be a part of the solution, And I think that we can start making a difference. But until we start talking about it openly, I don't see much of a change coming.
Oh, I'm going to let Ms. Bonsi go and have comment to that. Ms. Bonsi, do you want to add anything to that conversation?
Yeah, so to Dr. Morgan's question initially, how do we begin having these conversations? And I think we have to be intentional about having these conversations. We as a community are a collective community. And to your point, both of you, Chuck Sparks and Dr. Morgan, there has been dissension, based on kind of these economic our economic differences, if you will. But I think we have to also name that young Black men, oftentimes their interactions with police are negative early on. It is the conversation that we have about the school to prison pipeline. So when they are going into schools, they are already being policed. Young Black men and young Black women and young brown children. And so I think we have to, again, go back to the foundation in which our communities are over policed. And for us to have a respect, if you will, there must be an understanding. And again, I think it goes to the system by which this is built. Because if you look at the implicit bias trainings, oftentimes, no matter who you are, Black or white, you still have an implicit bias towards Black people in the community. So how can we be intentional about having these conversations, particularly not just with police, right, but with those who feel that there is a need for more law enforcement? What does that mean? And oftentimes when we get to the crux of that, it is having more of those investments early on in those communities. So yes, it starts in the home, but what are other outlets in which young people have long before they have an interaction with a police officer?
Katrina, one of your commenters asked a question: can we somehow police the police?
I saw that.
Great question, and the answer is I think gets to the crux of the matter. We have had systems before. We can have systems where the police are policed by the community, but not always in the form of a commission or some group that's put in place to have oversight once something happens negative.
Right.
I'm talking about people being able to police the police just like the police anybody else who is in a position of power. When you live in the community with them, when you understand who these people are, the police are being held accountable by their daily interactions with the citizenry. What we have now is people who police us who don't live in the community with us. They live outside the community and therefore have no sensitivity to the issues that are going on. And that creates an imbalance of understanding. I think we can get back to that if we have more people who are within our community policing us. And I think that's doable.
And I want to make this comment. I'm glad you brought that up, Judge. Is that I think when you talk about having this conversation, reintroducing this conversation to younger people, and I consider myself one of the young folks, let's be clear. I think the other part of that conversation is ownership, right? I think that, and I remember being a little girl and having civics and being taught to respect the police. It was just really hard for me to comprehend that when I would see them disrespecting my next door neighbor or disrespecting someone in my family. And so I think one of the part of some of this is about ownership, right? There has been somebody left the gate open. There's a generational situation where that has not been passed down for whatever reason, right? And I think that there has to be some ownership in our community, definitely, about our role. You know, you have somebody kill someone, somebody don't know who do it, and they won't even say it. They won't say a word because we have a policy of no snitching, right? And so that doesn't help the community. That doesn't make it safer. That doesn't make people want to move in there. All it does is perpetuate the stereotypes, right? And I know that there are some reasons why people do that. That, you know, they're afraid to speak out because it may be retaliation. I get all that, but I do think that there has to be some ownership in the Black community, in our role in making sure that we police ourselves, right? That's important too, to make sure that we're holding each other accountable, and our communities are safe. Somebody just posted this question. I really wanted to get your opinion on it. Judge, I'm sorry, did anybody want to add anything before we move to the next question? So somebody just posted this question. They were saying that a lot of times Black on Black crime is always mentioned when we talk about police brutality, right? People will say, well, you guys only want to march when they kill a black person, but black people kill each other every day. What are your opinions and thoughts on that, as far as black on black crime, and the fact that pretty much every race has white on white crime? You're more likely to be killed by somebody who is within your own race. I mean, that's data that proves that, right? But that is only always focused on black crime, only when we're talking about police brutality.
In criminology, as criminologists, we tried to get rid of that whole idea of black on black crime, because crime is crime. And so, you know, and you're right, crime, particularly violent crime, is intraracial, that usually the victim and the offender are of the same race. So it makes it appear that, you know, when a black person kills another black person or assaults another black person, that it's, oh, it's a great anomaly. It happens too in every community. So that whole idea is, and I tell my students, get rid of that idea of black on black crime. Crime is crime. And, you know, a person who's killed, you know, whether black or white, that person is dead. And so we're trying to get rid of that whole concept of black on black crime, because it really is inappropriate. And so we as criminologists, we've done away with that. You know, there is no certain black on black crime. There are African Americans, there are black males who kill other black males. And, you know, crime is intraracial, you know, particularly violent crime is intraracial. So forget about that concept of black on black crime.
Absolutely. Ms. Bosby, I'll let you go. And George, I'll let you go after her. Ms. Bosby, go ahead.
Dr. Morgan, thank you so much for setting that up. Crime is intraracial, crime is crime. And oftentimes when people elevate this issue, it is simply a red herring, if you will, to minimize the Black death and what we see. And I think what is critical and a key sticking point is when people say that, it is evidence that they are not in community with our community, because if so, they would see the work being done by community members, particularly by Black women and Black mothers and influencers in our community that are often always holding us accountable for those particular things. It is the fact that maybe those things aren't elevated because you are not proximate to community. Right. And I think that is foundational in what we have to talk about, and not I shouldn't say be dissuaded, but be distracted from the issue on police brutality as it relates to Black life.
Judge.
Yeah, I think Ms. Bosby and Dr. Morgan have certainly hit all the salient points on this. I also think that there may be a couple of other things, and maybe we don't talk about this like we should. First, the issue of the killing of innocent or unarmed, let me say that, unarmed African Americans has gained so much traction because of the social media lifestyle we live in now, because you can put it all on display right now, and it's gained a backing because it's wrong. It's wrong. I mean, we there's no if or ands or buts about it. It's wrong to kill unarmed Black people under those circumstances. But those are issues that need to be vetted through a judicial process. Right now, they're being vetted in the media. They're being vetted on social media platforms. And so that creates much more discussion about those issues. The other thing about killing Black people killing Black people is, and I don't think we talk about this enough, Katrina, but you know, my teaching, my training, my experience in court tells me that everybody in the Black community, when there's a Black person killed, doesn't necessarily consider that a crime. All right, they think that maybe sometimes people deserve what they get, and so they're not going to come out and talk about it. And we talk about those situations. They don't want to go to the justice system to resolve those issues. They want some self-justice. Now, we won't talk about those things. But that's one reason. We always think that they won't talk because they're afraid to go and talk. It's not always the case. That's not always the case, and we don't talk about that enough in our community. For some reason, we've thought that the justice that the system would give would not be the justice that the situation deserved. And that's why we need a deeper discussion about how important the actual justice system is, not taking crime into our own hands and resolving issues ourselves. We need to talk about those things.
Well, Judge, I agree with that. I think that the question was more posed about that is an issue, but it's not anything that's just relegated to just Black people. You have white people that don't go to the police and they meet justice in the street with each other. Like, I think that you never hear white on white crime when white people kill white people. We just saw white on white crime 2 weeks ago at the Capitol. So this idea that it's not something that is talked about the way it is talked about when it comes to Black people. Yes, there is, I agree with you 100%, but I think the conversation or the question was about not allowing it to get in the way or allow that to get us so bogged down as if we're the only people that have interracial issues, that we have community issues, that we have trust issues. Like, this is true almost of every race that exists. So any other comments to that question? I'm sorry.
That it gets more media attention? Is that the issue, that it gets more media attention when it's a Black on Black situation? Or tell me how you understand that.
Now, I don't know. I can wait for them to reply back. So I don't know exactly what their thought is, but I think that I think in some of the question, it may be that when Black people kill Black people, and I know sometimes crimes go unsolved, but there's usually somebody's usually arrested most of the time. Their justice is taking place. However, we have seen when Black people, unarmed Black people, are killed, that police officers get off. People get off. They go free and they brag about it.
Lack of accountability.
Right. And so that goes back to people not having trust in the actual justice system. I agree with you. I'm a lawyer. I'm with you that there is a place for that. But we know all too well that there are people in jail right now on marijuana charges, and we have legalized it and people are making millions of dollars off of it now. Like, those are the types of conversations I think that Black people are like, yeah, this is not fair. This is why we don't trust the system, because when we hand them over to you, you let them go free. So, I'm sorry, just you want to reply, or Dr. Bosby, Ms. Bosby, or Dr. Morgan?
I was just thinking about code of the street, that idea of code of the street, that we take matters, certain communities will take matters into their own hands because they don't really believe that the police will or even care to do anything about it. And we do, and also understanding that there is a double standard of justice, that crimes, committed in the Black community are oftentimes not treated the same as crimes that are committed. There is a double standard of justice. I mean, we have to be realistic about that. And we saw that, with the Capitol riot. I mean, people have been talking about that, and that's one of the questions I want to talk with my students about. There is a double standard of justice. And so Black defendants, Black offenders are treated differently, depending on who the race of the victim is and some other variables as well. And so because of that, many times people in the Black community just do not trust, the police to care enough, or the justice system to care enough, or willing to really address their needs. And so the code of the street.
I agree with all that she has just said. And in fact, the issue of the DC situation with the riots, I don't know that there's hardly anyone in our community, the African American community, who does not believe that would have been a different level of law.
Oh gosh, it would have been tear gas.
You could have taken all of the alphas, Qs, omegas, AKAs, deltas, and put us down there to protest, and all would be college educated folk. We would get a different look by law enforcement if we had been down there protesting from the beginning. And so there's little doubt now. I think the powers that be recognize implicitly that there's a different level of policing that was available then. The question is, how much pressure are we going to put on the powers that be to make sure that there is equal consequences for that? That's the complication. We're aware that there's an imbalance in terms of policing, but we can put the consequences on those who support that kind of belief at the ballot box. And I don't know that we often do that. So let's make sure we keep that pressure on.
That's good. Ms. Bosby, I look like you about to say something. Go ahead.
I did, because I really want to bring it back. And this is really in the frame of the ACLU. There must be a paradigm shift in how we look at modern day policing. And I think that this is so foundational in these conversations that we have. When you have an institution built on white supremacy, the accountability and the obligation often goes to the communities that are disproportionately affected by the system. And that is Black folk, that is brown folk, they are marginalized people, poor people, and that is what it is. And I think, and we can get in depth to the Capitol riots, but I think that has to be a real conversation on how we shift that paradigm and build more community-focused institutions and interventions. And once we are able to do that as a collective, yes, at the ballot box, yes, at our state legislature, but primarily as a community grassroots effort, I think that these conversations shift. But I do not want the conversation on modern day policing as a punitive system is foundational, and that is an issue in and of itself. And I think luckily Dr. Morgan, you, Katrina, and Judge Sparks has really laid that foundation, but I also think it's important in absolutely naming it for what it is.
Right. Well, and I think also too, Judge said it, you said it, Dr. Morgan has said it, that when I hear people are shocked with like, I don't know how this happened. How did they get in the Capitol? And that's because there is a picture painted of white people that they're not aggressive, that they're not violent, that they can be talked to, that they can be reasoned with. I saw a video the other day where a lady kicked out one of the windows in the Capitol, and the police was escorting her down the steps to go to her car as if she was some damsel in distress. And so there is a difference in how we saw that this summer, right? When we had the protesters and the marches, we had the president bring out the National Guard. The National Guard, they were picking people up, throwing them in cars, unmarked cars, and going away with them. And this idea that we will sit here and say that, well, we can't say for sure if it would be different if they were Black. I just think that's a lie. And I think that we aren't honest when we don't have that type of conversation. I agree with you 100%, Ms. Busby, as it relates to calling it what it is, white supremacy. And that's what you have a lot of, and it's built on that system. And we perpetuate that sometimes without even knowing it.
So, Katrina, how do we move on to another level? What do we do different? I think it's one of the questions you ask us. What's tomorrow look like for our community?
Oh, that's good. Dr. Morgan looked like she got an answer.
Well, I think in understanding the future and where we're going, we've got to understand the past. And when we look at our past, I mean, there has been problematic interaction with the Black community and between the Black community and police and with the entire criminal justice system since slavery. I mean, when you go back and look at slavery, you had slave patrols. These were law enforcement officers who were responsible for enforcing slave codes, and they did it with brutality. They did it, failing to respect, a white person. You could be killed for that. What I see is what I often say is really an issue, two issues of unequal protection and unequal enforcement that through history, we have seen at every major point in history, we have seen those negative interactions. We saw them during slavery. We saw them during the Jim Crow era. We saw them during the Civil Rights era. And, during that, now we're seeing them again. So again, we've got to go back and understand the history of those interactions, starting with the police. I mean, I can go with courts, I can go with corrections, but looking at police. So we've got to understand that this is not easy. Oh, let's just sit down and develop a citizens action group. We've got to understand, go back and look at the history of those negative interactions. And many times police were complicit, something like lynching. Police were complicit with that. They oftentimes handed over the Black defendants to that white lynch mob. And so we've got to go back and look at history. Unequal protection and unequal enforcement, usually over enforcement. And so those negative interactions didn't just start, a couple of years ago, since 2015, or the killing of Michael Brown, but they go back to slavery. And we've got to understand, how can we change attitudes? How can we, move forward, looking at history and knowing that those interactions they've been toxic, and there is a toxic legacy of negativism between the Black community and the policing department, but the entire criminal justice system. Let's just be honest about it.
Ms. Bosby, go ahead. You unmuted. I don't know if you want to say something.
So Dr. Morgan, you are preaching past the plate today, but I do think that is an incredibly important when we think about, and this all really aligns when we look, and I think the question was posed, Judge Sparks, where is our path forward? And Dr. Morgan, your response is, but what is the path forward? We must understand the history and the foundation by which we got here. And truthfully, in every reconstruction or shift, particularly that progresses the quality of life of Black folk, there is a backlash. And I think that is incredibly important when we name what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, is that we have to understand what happened on January 5th. Right. And when we understand that, I think that puts into context everything that we are seeing in the conversation, even regarding the criminal legal system, right? So the history, particularly as I think about what happened a couple of weeks ago, is in 1874 in Barber County, and what happened in that massacre, when Black folks, after the 15th Amendment was passed, we moved forward, we elected a individual who supported Reconstruction. White supremacists came and overturned that election, essentially, and that's what we saw. Then 91 years later, on Bloody Sunday, state-sanctioned violence towards Black folks, again, advancing their voice, particularly at the ballot box. The idea of putting Black people under this dominant structure is what we see in policing and what we saw particularly at the Capitol. And what is the conversation around that? Yes, my question again is, what is the path forward? But it is understanding that there is always backlash, whether it is state-sanctioned violence by way of policing in the criminal legal system that we see all too often now, and understanding that has been the way to essentially put us under some level of dominance. And we again need to reimagine what our lives look like outside of what the criminal legal system has done for the Black community or is not done, and how we identify things and call them for what it is.
And I think to your point that you can't have unity without some accountability. Like even in repentance to God, there's an acknowledgement of what you've done. Like this idea that now we need to unify, now we need to just move forward without consequences, without accountability, without acknowledgement, that is always true anytime something is done. When you think about how when Dr. King was killed, that was a call for unity, and rightfully so in some cases, but no accountability in what even brought us to that point. And I think the honest conversation about how they treated Barack Obama, because they created Trump and how they treated Barack Obama. All those things tie back to this accountability, this honest conversation about race and white supremacists, and how demonizing him, calling him the Antichrist for 8 years gave rise to something terrible, basically. So, I don't know, Judge. I don't know that
the bottom line is 244 years has not been enough for this we call America to actually create a more perfect union. 244 years just hadn't been enough for justice to be established properly. 244 years has not ensured domestic tranquility, nor has it allowed us to teach folk how to provide for welfare. We're still working out this experiment called America. And the problem has been it was too monochromatic in its inception. In other words, just white folk were trying to create the blueprint. And now you've got an infusion of minorities coming in and putting their part in the table and their part in the equation. And when you do that, that's what America is doing in creating this more perfect union. And it's going to take much more of that melding of colors and people and cultures and backgrounds for us to get to the place where we are more sensitive, where we absolutely understand how other people work, how they interact with one another. We have communities that are afraid of other communities, even though they are just as educated, just as economically viable and stable. And until we can get to a level of understanding, until we can start teaching the next generation that those things that we taught as traditional and foundational are good things. We need to have respect for one another. We need to have cultural norms and mores. We can't throw those things out in the institutions that we use to teach those things. Sometimes we have disavowed. I want to say this, like we got to go back to some of that old stuff we used to teach. How to respect themselves first and then respect other people. Those things are lost. We're not absolutely. We got the history, but I'm convinced that the future can be brighter if we just start talking to one another and listening to one another and moving forward in a concerted effort to make our communities better. We're still working this experiment out, but we'll get there. America will, in fact, be America at some point. It's just not fully there now. Some of us realize some blessings and some benefits, but not enough of us have realized those blessings and those benefits. And until we can pull other folk up to realize those blessings, we're going to struggle like we are right now. Everybody got to get involved in it.
I have. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Ms. Bosman, then Dr. Morgan, you can go.
Okay.
I do, before we get too far off in this conversation, Attorney Brown, I did just want to elevate the conversation regarding accountability for policing. I think we have to talk about qualified immunity and what that looks like as a policy, and what that looks like to essentially repeal that policy for holding policing accountable. Because I know that there's this question on, we know the history. And sometimes we as a community do know the history, but collectively, I do not think that people know what that history looks like. But as far as accountability, when it comes to policing, qualified immunity is an issue that essentially has stifled that level of accountability for citizens, for victims of police brutality and their families, and getting the level of accountability needed, because that does not come by way of the system itself. It must come from the community. And that's something that we have to be intentional about, and understanding that that is a policy that we as citizens have the power to essentially repeal.
I agree.
Dr. Morgan, before you go, I was going to say really quickly is that, I'm 37, I think. 37. And I think about, my grandmother and my great grandmother, the very same things that we're talking about right now, marching about right now, arguing about right now, they were doing the same thing. And my point is that at what point will it happen? And I get what Judge was saying about it takes time, but we literally are asking for the exact same thing that my grandmother and great grandmother and some of you guys even on this call have been calling for and asking for since before I was born. And I think at some point, I think that's one thing about this new generation. They're not okay with the norm and the status quo and waiting for time to take its course. And I think that's something, I agree that there is a level of respect and they need to know the history of some things. But I think at some point we've got to call it what it is, and we've got to set in place people that we elect who are going to carry out the wishes of the community. We have to hold, I listen, Black people got Joe Biden elected. Now, Joe better get in there and do something. But until Black people start, I think sometimes we're so caught up in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They don't court us. They don't do anything for us. And we never have the conversation about, in the next 4 years, we need to be talking about our own leader that we want to represent us. We should be homing and looking now in the next 4 years so that we can raise up somebody who is going to deal with our. Dr. Morgan, go ahead.
No, that was some time ago, talking about accountability. I often say that one of the reasons we allow this to continue is because if you're never held accountable, for your behavior. And I remember with the Michael Brown case where the prosecutor got up and presented to the grand jury something that, fleeing felon rule, basically. He basically said, well, he was fleeing and, that was a problem. And I'm thinking, this was gone, back in 1980s when, Tennessee versus Garner, and the fleeing felon rule. And so we really have to, this whole idea of qualified immunity. I study liability issues for people in corrections, particularly probation parole officers. And I can't understand why we still allow this whole idea of qualified immunity to allow police officers to get off, and not be held accountable, because until they are held accountable, we will continue to see, when you start making examples of some of the people who, you shoot somebody in the back, but I was fearing for my life. But when you start holding people accountable, those kinds of incidents and those kinds of excuses will cease. So we have to, and you're right, young people now, I have 2 young adults and they are not, willing to to accommodate and put up with some things that I put up with. And so, and we need you. That's what I tell my students. We need you to be the voice. We
Right.
need you.
So I have two questions because time is winding down really quickly. So I wanted to deal with the phrase "Blue Lives Matter," right? We've heard that in response to Black Lives Matter. There has been, anytime you hear Blue Lives Matter, it has been this conversation about Black people hating police officers, Black people not wanting police officers, Black people not respecting police officers, and that, blue lives are about them putting their lives on the line. And so I wanted to ask this question: what is your response to that? What does that look like? What does Blue Lives Matter really mean as it relates to Black Lives Matter? And are those two things mutually exclusive, or is there some justification in saying that?
Blue lives didn't matter at the Capitol by people who say Blue Lives Matter. So did they matter on January 6th?
Okay. Judge?
Well, the complication I've seen in simply stating that Blue Lives Matter is when there's a Black life in the blue.
Right.
That's the complication. Does the Black life matter if it's in the blue? And I think we've allowed a red herring to get into the discussion. That's all. I don't want us to run down that rabbit hole.
Right.
Stand that whole conversation was co-opted by a movement to minimize what Black Lives Matter means. It had nothing to do with the police department in the first place.
Nothing to do with it.
And we've allowed too much energy to get behind that, Katrina. And I think most right-thinking people understand the concept of Black Lives Matter, and they also understand the significance of police officers within our community and why we need them to continue policing us.
Absolutely. Okay. Ms. Cosby, did you want to comment to that? Make comment to that?
I think Dr. Morgan and Judge Sparks have elevated it clearly. We need not focus on anything that is a red herring to minimize the fact that Black lives matter. Full stop.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't think we should get into that conversation.
Absolutely. Got you. Okay. So our last question is, what does justice for Black America look like for you? What do you want? What are your hopes for justice as it relates to Black Americans and Black America in general? Anybody can go. Dr. Morgan, you want to go first?
Okay. I want to be, there was a book called The Rich Get Rich and the Poor Get Prison. And so when I look at that book, he starts off the book saying that the criminal justice system is designed to fail, that it is designed to fail, that the way it's set up, with the laws and, victimless crimes, it's designed to fail. And it protects those who have power and money, and those who are poor end up in prison. So I would like to see a justice system, one, that where police officers interact with people in the same way and people are treated in the same way. And if there is discretion, it is based on something other than race, gender, age, and SES, socioeconomic status. I would like to see prosecutors who have a major responsibility for cases that go to court and cases that, and what charges are filed. I want to see them base it on the evidence and base it on, past criminal history, those kinds of things, and not whether or not they can get a conviction. I want to see people treated equally and fairly in court. So if they are appointed, a court-appointed attorney, then they will make sure that that person receives adequate justice. Sentencing is done fairly. So you follow up and you do pre-sentence investigation reports for everybody, and you make sentencing recommendations to the court based on that. And then I want to see people who go to prison have some kind of rehabilitation, something that, so recidivism rates aren't, people who are released don't go back, 66% of those don't go back in 2 years. So I think just being treated fairly, and that's what people want. That's what, when I worked probation, that's what they wanted. They wanted to be treated fairly, equitably. And it's not just about race, it's about money, it's about class as well. And I want to see those things not matter.
Right. Ms. Bosley, you want to go next?
I do want to start off with a quote that is one of my favorites as we commemorate Dr. King today. And it states, "The oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself." And I think that the last part, the yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself. We are focusing now on a title of a book on how we get free. And I think that that is incredibly important when we look at what this means for us. I can't underscore the importance of reimagining what policing, what this world looks like. To your point, Attorney Brown, really moving past parity politics and understanding what investment in community looks like for us, focusing on local, really our local politics. In 2022, we are going to have 67 counties that are going to be voting for district attorneys that affect sentencing, that affect our criminal legal reform system, and the things that we've talked about today. We have to hold our people accountable, and folks at the ballot box have to be progressive in how they look at those issues. So getting back to local politics, what that looks like for us, and really focusing on how we envision freedom. And I think when we have reimagined that, however that looks, that is the place that we are getting to. And that is what I am excited about, because I know that we have the ability to do that as a collective.
Right.
Judge.
Trina, it's a really complex question.
And I made it the last one.
Yeah, I don't know that we should spend our next 4 years thinking that Joe Biden is going to solve all the problems for us, because I don't think that's going to happen. He might do some things that may benefit us, but I believe our solutions are probably going to be a little more local than that. And so I'd like to see leaders in place who are compassionate and who care about the people in the community and use the mechanism of government to alleviate the burdens that people have. I'd like to see judges on the bench who are not content with just letting people pass through their courtroom and leaving in the same conditions, broken conditions they show up in, but using the mechanisms of the community to help them get better. I like to see prosecutors who are more convinced that justice is important than just getting somebody taken care of. And I'd like to see a community where education has the utmost value for young folk and for anybody who wants to be educated. All these things require a community that's willing to invest its dollars and its time and its talent in ensuring that the next generation comes out better than we did. We've made some mistakes, we've made some strides, but we got to keep working together.
Absolutely. And I want to say this as we're closing out. I have been an attorney for almost 10 years now, but I had the pleasure as a young attorney to serve and work with Judge Sparks in his homeless court. And that was my first time understanding that there are people out here doing the work. Like when you hear some of the things that are being said on here, people are out here doing the work. You look at what Judge Owens is doing with drug court. These things work. And I've seen situations where judge has told someone, listen, you know, here's going to be your thing. You need to read to your son every night. And he needs to sign off on a sheet of paper saying that you've read to him, because that's what's important. I think when he says things like, you know, we have to have judges that look at a situation and look at the household and say, here's where the need is. We do have people like that in place. We need more of those people. And so my hope for us as a community is that we begin to educate ourselves about the people that we're voting for. And when people are not doing what they have promised us to do, then we need to find somebody else. We need to raise up another leader, and we need to hold each other accountable and our community accountable. That's my hope for us. Any final words? We have 2 minutes. That's it. Any final words, anybody?
Well, King said it best, that riots are the language of the unheard. And if people continue to not be listened to, we'll continue to have uprisings and problems. We need to start listening to people and talking to people and listening to them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any Ms. Bosby, Dr. Morgan, any final thoughts?
This has been a good conversation, and I appreciate being a part of it. But again, as young people, you know, I tell my students all the time, you're the voices now, and you can't be afraid to tackle some of these issues and address them boldly, and understand that, you know, we talk about, I like the term that Judge Sparks used, you know, and saw some of that pastor come out. And but I like that term habilitation, because we can't assume that people have ever been, you know, in a position where they had the rules, they knew the norms, they were taught the right things and the right values. And so we're dealing with a generation that's been socialized a little bit differently than we have. And so we have to be more compassionate. Thank you all so much for the work you're doing. And I will try and send some people to you all, some students, so they can gain some of your wisdom and knowledge. And so thanks again to the BCRI for doing these conversations. I appreciate them so much. And I've listened to them, and I appreciate these conversations.
All right, Ms. Bosby, we got like 1 minute.
1 minute.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Attorney Brown. Anytime I get the opportunity to sit and listen and be amongst my elders at the age of 33, I am exceptionally grateful. And I do want to thank Dr. Morgan and Judge Sparks for your wisdom and for your time, and to be a part of this conversation. I think it is absolutely necessary, and understanding that we are not in a moment, but we are in a movement. And as we move forward together as a collective, we are working to get free, and we will get there. So I am excited about what this looks like for us. So thank you so much for allowing me to join you.
And on behalf of myself and the panel, I want to thank everybody that has tuned in. And to echo Dr. Morgan, we definitely want to thank the Civil Rights Institute for allowing us to have this very honest and transparent conversation. Stay tuned. I know they have some other events happening today. We appreciate you guys. Have a good rest of the day.